The metals clinked softly against my chest as I stood at attention. 23 years of service reduced to bronze and silver pins. But all I could think about was Dad's old service photo, still hanging in Mom's hallway, his own medals gleaming just as bright. Standing in the funeral home parking lot, rain soaking through my thrift store dress, I watched my brother Marcus laugh with our cousins about how I'd finally have to get a real job now that Dad was gone. What he didn't know was that 20 minutes later, when Mr. Henderson opened Dad's will, Marcus would discover that the family construction empire he'd been bragging about inheriting for years was never going to be his. The look on his face when he realized Dad had been secretly documenting every cruel word, every dismissive comment, every time Marcus had written me off as the family disappointment, was worth every tear I'd shed over the past 15 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of Dad's funeral started like every other day in my cramped studio apartment above Chen's electronics repair shop in downtown Portland. My alarm buzzed at 5:30, and I rolled out of bed knowing I had exactly 3 hours to get ready, drive the 40 minutes to Willow Creek, and somehow find the courage to face my family again. I'd been dreading this day for months, ever since Dad's cancer diagnosis, not because I didn't love him, but because I knew what awaited me at Riverside Memorial Chapel. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a 32-year-old woman who looked perpetually tired, dark circles under green eyes that matched Dad's, brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail because I couldn't afford the salon visits my sister-in-law Grace got weekly. The black dress hanging on my closet door was the same one I'd worn to my college graduation 8 years ago, when Marcus had made his first public declaration that I was wasting my engineering degree by working for a nonprofit environmental consulting firm instead of joining Morrison Construction like every other family member. Dad had built Morrison Construction from nothing, starting with a single pickup truck and a toolbox after he came back from Vietnam in 1972. By the time I was born in 1991, the company employed over 200 people and had constructed half the commercial buildings in our county. The Morrison name meant something in Willow Creek, Oregon. It meant quality, reliability, and steady work for 3 generations of local families. It also meant expectations that I'd spent my entire adult life failing to meet. Growing up, I'd loved spending summers at construction sites with Dad, wearing a tiny hard hat he'd had custom made for me, learning about load-bearing walls and foundation pours while other kids were at summer camp. Dad would explain how concrete cured, why steel beams had to be positioned just so, and how every building was like a puzzle where every piece mattered. I absorbed it all, dreaming of the day I'd work beside him, and Marcus creating structures that would stand for decades. But somewhere around my sophomore year of high school, the family dynamic shifted. Marcus, 4 years older, had dropped out of Oregon State after 2 semesters and come home to work full-time for Dad. He'd always been the golden child, the one who looked like Dad with his broad shoulders and easy smile, who could charm subcontractors and clients alike. When I announced I wanted to study environmental engineering, instead of business or construction management, the disappointment was palpable. The first real crack appeared during Christmas dinner my junior year of college. I'd been explaining my thesis project on sustainable building materials when Marcus interrupted with a laugh that made my stomach clench. "Come on, Dad," he'd said, cutting into his prime rib with theatrical precision. "You know Sarah's just going through a phase. All this environmental stuff is just college nonsense. She'll come home after graduation and learn the real family business." Dad had looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Mom, always the peacekeeper, had quickly changed the subject to Grace's pregnancy announcement. But I'd seen something in Dad's eyes that night, a flicker of interest when I'd mentioned green building techniques, that gave me hope he understood what I was trying to accomplish. After graduation, I'd taken a position with Pacific Environmental Solutions, a small firm that specialized in helping companies reduce their environmental impact while maintaining profitability. The work was exactly what I'd trained for, consulting with businesses on everything from energy-efficient HVAC systems to sustainable material sourcing. The pay was modest, but the satisfaction was immense, especially when I helped a client save thousands of dollars annually while reducing their carbon footprint. Marcus saw it differently. At every family gathering, he'd introduce me to people as our little environmental warrior, or the family idealist, with a tone that made it clear he considered my career an elaborate form of unemployment. When I tried to explain how my work with green building certifications could actually benefit construction companies, he'd wave me off with condescending patience. That's all government regulation nonsense, Sarah. Real builders focus on getting quality structures up fast and under budget. All that green stuff is just marketing for clients who want to feel good about themselves. The breaking point came 3 years ago at Dad's 65th birthday party. I'd spent weeks preparing a presentation about how Morrison Construction could expand into sustainable building, complete with market research showing the growing demand for LEED-certified commercial spaces and residential developments. I'd analyzed their current projects and identified specific areas where green upgrades could increase both profit margins and client satisfaction. Marcus barely let me finish the first slide before he stood up, beer in hand, and delivered what became known in family lore as the speech. He told the assembled crowd of relatives, employees, and family friends that while he appreciated my college education and all, the construction business was about results, not theories. He painted a picture of Morrison Construction as a no-nonsense operation that had thrived for decades by focusing on traditional methods that worked, not chasing every environmental fad that came along. Dad built this company with his hands and his head, Marcus had concluded, gesturing toward our father, who sat quietly at the head of the table, not with fancy degrees or government certifications. When I take over, we'll keep doing what works, and maybe Sarah can find a nice nonprofit somewhere that needs someone to write reports about saving the whales. The laughter that followed felt like a physical blow. Even relatives who'd known me since birth nodded along, as if Marcus had spoken some obvious truth that everyone had been too polite to mention. Dad had thanked me for the presentation afterward, saying it was very thorough, but the damage was done. Marcus had successfully positioned my expertise as irrelevant academia, my passion as naive idealism, and my future role in the family business as non-existent. Over the following years, the pattern became entrenched. At Christmas, Marcus would update everyone on Morrison Construction's latest projects while I sat silently. Any attempt to contribute met with subtle eye rolls or comments about how environmental regulations were making everything more complicated and expensive. When I got promoted to senior consultant at Pacific Environmental Solutions, Marcus congratulated me with the observation that it was nice to see nonprofit work paying off, despite the fact that my firm was very much for profit and my salary had nearly doubled. The worst part wasn't Marcus's dismissiveness, it was watching Dad retreat into himself during these exchanges. The man who'd once encouraged my questions about construction techniques and building science became increasingly quiet when family conversations turned to business. I told myself he was just trying to keep peace between his children, but part of me wondered if he'd come to agree with Marcus's assessment of my career choices. Everything changed last spring when Dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The aggressive timeline, 6 months at best, put the family succession question into sharp focus. Marcus immediately positioned himself as Dad's right hand, taking over more day-to-day operations, and making it clear to employees and clients that he was the natural heir to Morrison Construction. He moved his family into Dad's house to help with care, though Grace seemed to spend more time redecorating than providing medical support. I drove down from Portland every weekend to spend time with Dad, but these visits became increasingly strained. Marcus had established himself as the gatekeeper, scheduling Dad's time and limiting his visitors based on his energy levels. My environmental consulting work, which required travel throughout the Pacific Northwest, was portrayed as evidence that I couldn't be relied upon for the daily responsibilities of caring for a dying father or running a construction company. The comments became more pointed as Dad's condition worsened. During what would turn out to be his final lucid week, I arrived for my scheduled Saturday visit to find Marcus holding court in the living room, with several of Morrison Construction's foremen, discussing upcoming projects and personnel changes. When I walked in, the conversation stopped, and Marcus looked at me with theatrical surprise. "Oh, Sarah, I didn't know you were coming today," he'd said, though we'd confirmed the visit by text that morning. "We're just going over some transition plans for when Dad needs to step back completely. You know, real business stuff that probably wouldn't interest you." One of the foremen, a man named Jerry, who'd worked for Dad for 20 years, had looked uncomfortable. "Good to see you, Sarah," he'd said. "Your dad talks about you all the time. Real proud of that environmental work you're doing." Marcus's smile had tightened. Dad's proud of both his kids, Jerry. Of course, running Morrison Construction is going to require someone who understands the industry from the ground up, someone who's been here every day learning the business, instead of chasing government grants in Portland. The implication was clear. While I'd been off pursuing my idealistic career, Marcus had been the dedicated son, preparing to carry on Dad's legacy. The fact that my government grants were actually private sector consulting contracts didn't matter. Marcus had crafted a narrative where his presence equaled dedication, and my professional success equaled abandonment of family responsibilities. I'd spent that visit reading to Dad in his bedroom, while Marcus held his informal board meeting downstairs. Dad seemed more alert than he'd been in weeks, asking detailed questions about my current projects and listening intently as I described a major contract I'd just secured with a hotel chain, looking to retrofit their properties for energy efficiency. For a moment it felt like the old days, when he genuinely valued my expertise. "You know," he'd said quietly, "I've been thinking about some of the things you mentioned in that presentation a few years back. About sustainable building practices." He'd paused, breathing carefully. I wish I'd listened more carefully at the time. Before I could respond, Marcus had appeared in the doorway. "Dad, you should rest. The doctor said too much excitement isn't good for you." He'd looked at me with meaningful intensity. "Maybe we should keep conversations light from now on. No work talk." That was the last substantial conversation I had with Dad before he slipped into the semi-conscious state that lasted his final 10 days. Marcus orchestrated those final days, like a political campaign, controlling access and managing Dad's image for the steady stream of visitors who came to pay their respects. Employees, clients, and family friends.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
All heard the same message. Marcus had been cultivating for months that Dad was proud of both his children, but that Morrison Construction needed steady leadership from someone who truly understood the business. The funeral itself unfolded exactly as I'd expected. Riverside Memorial Chapel was packed with 3 generations of Morrison Construction employees, clients, suppliers, and family friends. Dad had been a fixture in Willow Creek for 50 years, and his death marked the end of an era. The service was beautiful, filled with stories about Dad's integrity, his loyalty to his workers, and his commitment to building structures that would outlast him. Marcus delivered the main eulogy, speaking movingly about Dad's legacy and his own commitment to preserving everything Dad had built. He talked about tradition, continuity, and the importance of keeping Morrison Construction true to its founder's vision. The subtext was unmistakable. Morrison Construction was in good hands with Marcus, and the company's future was secure. I spoke briefly about Dad's curiosity, his willingness to learn new things even late in life, and his genuine care for the environment that had shaped our corner of Oregon. It was a subtle tribute to the man who'd encouraged my interest in sustainable building, but I kept it general enough that Marcus couldn't object. After the service, the traditional gathering at the Morrison family home felt like a celebration of Marcus's impending inheritance. Grace played the gracious hostess, while Marcus worked the room like a politician, accepting condolences and reassuring everyone that Morrison Construction would continue without interruption. I helped in the kitchen, serving coffee and arranging casseroles brought by neighbors, trying to stay busy enough to avoid the increasingly awkward conversations with relatives who clearly saw me as the family member who'd chosen career over loyalty. The breaking point came when I overheard Marcus talking to our cousin David near the fireplace, where Dad's construction awards were displayed. David had asked about my plans now that Dad was gone, and Marcus's response hit me like a physical blow. "Well, Sarah's got her environmental consulting thing up in Portland," Marcus had said with the patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. "She's always been the idealistic one, wants to save the world, one energy audit at a time." Dad always hoped she'd come home and join the real family business, but some people just aren't cut out for the construction industry. It's not personal, it's just practical. Morrison Construction needs leadership from someone who understands that building things requires more than theories and good intentions. He'd paused, looking around to make sure he had his audience's attention. "The truth is, Dad's been worried about Sarah for years. Living alone in that little apartment, working for companies that barely pay enough to cover rent. He told me just last month that he hoped this whole environmental phase would run its course, and she'd realize she needs something more stable, more real." David had nodded sympathetically. "It's tough when family members don't see eye to eye about the future." "Exactly," Marcus had continued, warming to his theme. "And honestly, Sarah's never really understood what Dad built here. She sees Morrison Construction as just another business that needs to be reformed and improved, when really it's a family legacy that needs to be preserved. Dad spent 50 years building something that works, and it's going to take someone who respects that tradition to keep it going." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Marcus wasn't just dismissing my career. He was rewriting history to make Dad complicit in his contempt. According to Marcus's version, my environmental work wasn't just irrelevant, it was a source of family concern and disappointment. He'd transformed my expertise into evidence of instability, and my passion into proof of impracticality. I walked outside to the back porch where Dad had taught me to identify different types of wood when I was 7 years old. The October air was crisp, and I could see the hills beyond Willow Creek, where Morrison Construction had built some of their first residential developments. For a moment I allowed myself to cry for everything I'd lost, not just Dad, but the family acceptance I'd spent my entire adult life seeking. That's when I heard the laughter from the living room window. Marcus was entertaining a group with another story about my naivety, describing how I'd once suggested Morrison Construction could market greenhouses to environmentally conscious buyers. Can you imagine? He was saying. Greenhouses, like the color of the paint, matters more than the foundation. The laughter that followed felt like the final judgment. I walked to my car, started the engine, and sat in the driveway for 10 minutes, trying to compose myself enough to drive safely back to Portland. I couldn't face another hour of being treated like the family member who'd never quite figured out how the real world worked. But as I put the car in reverse, I saw Mr. Henderson, Dad's longtime attorney, pulling into the driveway. Family tradition dictated that the will reading would happen after the funeral reception, once the extended family and friends had left and only immediate family remained. Part of me wanted to just keep driving, to skip the formal confirmation of what everyone already knew: Marcus would inherit Morrison Construction, and I would receive some token bequest that acknowledged my existence without threatening his control. Instead, I turned off the engine and walked back inside. Whatever humiliation awaited me in that living room, I owed it to Dad to see his final wishes carried out properly. Marcus could have his moment of triumph, and then I could drive back to Portland and start building a life that didn't depend on family approval or acceptance. The next 20 minutes would change everything I thought I knew about my father, my family, and my own future in ways I never could have imagined. Henderson entered the house, carrying his familiar leather briefcase, the same one he'd brought to every Morrison family legal matter for the past 20 years. His weathered face carried the gravity appropriate for the occasion, but there was something else in his expression, a tension I couldn't quite identify. He nodded solemnly to the remaining family members scattered throughout the living room, and asked if we could gather for the reading of Dad's will. Marcus immediately took charge, directing people to seats with the natural authority he'd been cultivating since Dad's diagnosis. Grace settled beside him on the main couch, smoothing her black dress and reaching for his hand in a gesture of supportive solidarity. I chose a chair near the window, partially hidden behind Dad's reading lamp, where I could observe without feeling exposed. Our aunts and uncles, the ones who'd stayed after the reception, arranged themselves in a semicircle facing Mr. Henderson like an informal tribunal. The attorney cleared his throat and removed a thick document from his briefcase, along with what appeared to be several sealed envelopes. "Before we begin," he said, his voice carrying the formal tone he used for serious legal matters, "I want you to know that your father spent considerable time over the past 18 months revising and refining his final wishes. He was very specific about how he wanted this reading conducted, and asked me to follow his instructions precisely." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his businessman's instincts engaged. "Of course, Mr. Henderson, Dad always was thorough about important decisions." "Indeed he was," the attorney replied, but something in his tone made me look up from my hands. Mr. Henderson was studying Marcus with an expression I'd never seen before, almost clinical in its assessment. "Your father also asked me to play this recording before we proceed with the formal will reading. He felt it would provide important context for his decisions." He pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind Dad had used for dictating notes about construction projects when his handwriting became too shaky. The sight of it made my chest tighten with unexpected grief. How many times had I heard that device clicking on and off in Dad's home office as he worked through the details of Morrison Construction business? "This recording was made 6 weeks ago," Mr. Henderson continued, "during one of our final meetings about the estate planning. Your father was quite lucid and very determined that his exact words be preserved." The room fell silent as he pressed play. Dad's voice, weakened by illness but still unmistakably his, filled the space where we'd shared so many family gatherings over the years. "If you're listening to this, it means I'm gone and you're all gathered for the will reading. I want to start by saying how much I love each of you and how proud I am of the people you've become, even when we haven't always seen eye to eye about the path forward." I felt tears beginning to form as his familiar cadence washed over me. Even in his final weeks, Dad had maintained the measured, thoughtful way of speaking that had made him such an effective leader and negotiator. I've spent the last year watching how my illness affected our family dynamics, and I've learned some things that surprised me. Some of you might think this recording is unnecessary, that a simple will reading would suffice, but I've come to believe that context matters. The decisions I've made about Morrison Construction and my estate aren't arbitrary. They're based on careful observation of character, capability, and integrity under pressure. Marcus shifted in his seat, his confident posture beginning to show signs of tension. Grace squeezed his hand, but her smile had become forced. Marcus, you've worked hard for Morrison Construction, and I appreciate your dedication to the company. You've learned the operational side of the business and built relationships with our long-term clients and subcontractors. You have natural leadership abilities and a strong work ethic that has served the company well over the past decade. The relief that crossed Marcus's face was visible to everyone in the room. This was exactly the validation he'd been expecting, the public acknowledgement of his role as Dad's chosen successor. He squeezed Grace's hand and nodded toward our relatives with the satisfaction of a man whose expectations were being confirmed. However, Dad's voice continued, and the single word seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. Leadership requires more than dedication and operational knowledge. It requires vision, adaptability, and the wisdom to recognize expertise, even when it challenges your existing assumptions. Over the past year, I've had time to reflect on decisions I made and opportunities I missed, particularly regarding Sarah's contributions to our family and her potential value to Morrison Construction. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, but I kept my gaze fixed on the recorder, afraid that any movement might somehow interrupt Dad's words. Sarah, I owe you an apology. For years I allowed family dynamics to overshadow my business judgment. When you presented that sustainability proposal 3 years ago, my immediate reaction was concern about how it might affect our established relationships and proven methods. But I've spent considerable time since then researching the topics you raised, consulting with industry professionals, and analyzing market trends in construction and development. My breath caught as Dad's voice grew stronger, more decisive. The truth is, Sarah was right about almost everything. Sustainable building practices aren't a passing trend or environmental activism, they're the future of construction. Companies that fail to adapt to green building standards, energy efficiency requirements, and environmental regulations aren't just missing opportunities, they're positioning themselves for obsolescence. The Morrison Construction of the next 50 years will need to embrace exactly the kind of expertise Sarah has spent her career developing. Marcus had gone very still, his confident expression replaced by something approaching alarm. The relatives who'd been nodding along with Dad's initial praise for Marcus now looked confused, unsure where this unexpected turn was leading. I've also had the opportunity to observe how both of my children handle pressure, criticism, and family conflict. Marcus, your loyalty to traditional methods has value, but your dismissal of new ideas and your treatment of Sarah's expertise has shown me concerning gaps in judgment. A leader who can't recognize and incorporate valuable input from family members is unlikely to adapt successfully to changing market conditions. The silence in the room was absolute. Grace had released Marcus's hand and was staring at the recorder with undisguised shock. Our Aunt Patricia looked like she was witnessing a car accident, unable to look away but horrified by what she was seeing. Sarah, on the other hand, has consistently demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking, professional competence, and personal integrity that Morrison Construction will need to thrive in the coming decades. Her success in environmental consulting proves she understands both the technical and business aspects of sustainable development. More importantly, she's maintained her principles and pursued her expertise despite years of family pressure to abandon her convictions. I was crying now, but silently overwhelmed by hearing Dad acknowledge things I'd never known he understood. The validation felt almost surreal after years of feeling like the family disappointment. I've also discovered some troubling information about financial irregularities and questionable business practices that have occurred during Marcus's increased involvement in company operations. These issues will be addressed separately through appropriate legal channels, but they've reinforced my concerns about entrusting Morrison Construction's future to leadership that prioritizes short-term gains over long-term sustainability and ethical business practices. Marcus shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger and panic. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice cracking slightly. Dad was sick, confused. He didn't understand what he was saying. Mr. Henderson held up a hand to stop the interruption. "Please allow the recording to finish, Marcus. Your father anticipated there might be objections to his reasoning and asked me to ensure his complete statement was heard. Dad's voice resumed, now carrying the unmistakable tone of a man making final non-negotiable decisions. Therefore, after careful consideration and consultation with legal and financial advisors, I've structured my estate to reflect my assessment of each person's character, capabilities, and potential contributions to preserving and growing the Morrison legacy. These decisions weren't made in anger or disappointment, but with deep love for my family and genuine hope for Morrison Construction's future success. The recording clicked off, leaving us in a silence so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Mr. Henderson carefully returned the device to his briefcase and picked up the formal will document. "Now if we may proceed with the official reading," he said, adjusting his glasses and opening to the first marked page. Marcus remained standing, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I want to challenge this," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. Dad was on medication, he wasn't thinking clearly. This whole thing is influenced by Sarah's manipulation during his illness. "Marcus, please sit down," Mr. Henderson said firmly. "Your father's mental competency was thoroughly documented throughout the estate planning process. He underwent formal evaluation by 2 independent physicians, specifically to ensure these decisions couldn't be challenged on those grounds. Additionally, he was not on any medications that would have affected his cognitive abilities during our meetings. The recordings and documentation are extensive and legally ironclad." Grace tugged at Marcus's sleeve, trying to pull him back to the couch, but he remained standing, staring at the attorney with barely contained rage. Henderson continued, "Your father provided detailed written explanations for each of his decisions, along with supporting documentation that will become relevant as we proceed. I strongly advise you to listen to the complete will reading before making any statements you might later regret." Marcus finally sat down, but his posture radiated tension and anger. I could see the calculations running behind his eyes, the desperate search for some legal or logical escape from whatever was coming. "The last will and testament of Robert James Morrison, Mr. Henderson began, his voice taking on the formal cadence of legal proceedings. "I, Robert James Morrison, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my final will and testament, superseding all previous wills and codicils." The standard opening language felt surreal given the emotional weight of Dad's recorded message. I tried to focus on the attorney's words, but part of me was still processing Dad's unexpected acknowledgement of my work and his criticism of Marcus's behavior. "To my beloved wife Margaret, who predeceased me by 8 years, I reaffirm my love and gratitude for 42 years of marriage and partnership in building both our family and our business." Dad always included Mom in his formal statements, even years after her death from cancer. It was one of the many small gestures that had made their relationship legendary among their friends and family. "To my extended family, friends and the employee Morrison Construction who have become like family over the decades, I leave my deepest appreciation for your loyalty, hard work, and contribution to our shared success." Henderson paused and turned to a new page, his expression becoming more serious. "To my son Marcus Morrison, I leave the sum of $50,000, the 1995 Ford pickup truck currently in the garage, and my collection of construction industry awards and memorabilia. I also forgive all outstanding loans and advances from Morrison Construction, totaling approximately $137,000 as of the date of this will." The numbers hit the room like physical blows. Marcus's face went white as the implications became clear. $50,000 was a substantial gift by normal standards, but it was a token amount compared to the multi-million-dollar value of Morrison Construction. The forgiveness of company loans suggested financial irregularities that went far beyond simple advances for personal expenses. Grace made a small choking sound and pressed her hand to her mouth. She'd clearly been counting on inheriting enough money to maintain their current lifestyle, which included the large house they'd purchased the year before Dad's diagnosis and the luxury cars Marcus had justified as necessary for his business image. "To my daughter Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, I leave the entirety of Morrison Construction, including all business assets, real estate holdings, equipment, current contracts, and intellectual property. I also leave her my personal residence and all remaining financial assets, including retirement accounts, investment portfolios, and insurance proceeds." The silence that followed was so profound it felt oppressive. I stared at Mr. Henderson, certain I'd misheard or misunderstood something fundamental. Morrison Construction wasn't just a business, it was a multi-generational empire worth several $1 million. The idea that Dad would leave it to me, the daughter who'd spent her career working for environmental consulting firms instead of learning the family business, seemed impossible. Marcus found his voice first, and it came out as a strangled shout. That's insane. Sarah doesn't know anything about running a construction company. She'll destroy everything Dad built. There's more, Mr. Henderson said calmly, turning to another page. Your father included several conditions and explanations for these decisions. He cleared his throat and continued reading. I am confident that Sarah possesses the intelligence, integrity, and vision necessary to guide Morrison Construction into the future. Her expertise in sustainable building practices, environmental regulations, and green technology positions the company to capitalize on emerging market opportunities that will define the construction industry over the next several decades. I felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Dad was entrusting to me. Morrison Construction employed over 200 people and had contracts worth millions of dollars. The responsibility felt crushing, especially given my complete lack of experience in actually running a construction business. However, the will continued. I recognize that operational expertise in construction management will be essential for success. Therefore, I am establishing a transition period during which Sarah will work with a board of advisors consisting of Morrison Construction's 3 most senior project managers, our chief financial officer, and an outside business consultant to ensure operational continuity. Marcus was shaking his head repeatedly, as if he could somehow deny what he was hearing through pure force of will. This is crazy, he muttered. She'll run it into the ground within a year. Additionally, Mr. Henderson continued, I am providing Sarah with detailed documentation of all business operations, financial irregularities that require immediate attention, and strategic recommendations for the company's future direction. I have also arranged for her to receive consulting support from industry experts in sustainable construction practices and green building certification. The attorney paused and looked directly at me. Sarah, your father wanted me to tell you that he spent his final months researching everything you'd tried to explain to the family over the years. He became convinced that your vision for environmentally responsible construction wasn't idealistic, it was pragmatic and necessary for long-term success. I couldn't speak, couldn't even process the emotional whiplash of going from family disappointment to inheriting the company that had defined my family's identity for 50 years. The magnitude of Dad's trust in me felt both humbling and terrifying. There's one final provision, Mr. Henderson said, his voice taking on a warning tone. Should Marcus or any other family member attempt to challenge this will or interfere with Sarah's management of Morrison Construction, they will forfeit any bequests and be permanently barred from any involvement with the company. Your father was very specific about protecting Sarah's authority to implement her vision for the business. Marcus erupted from the couch, pacing toward the window with barely controlled fury. This is unbelievable. 20 years I've worked for that company. 20 years of learning every aspect of the business, building relationships, proving my dedication. And he gives it all to someone who's never even worked in construction. Actually, I said quietly, finding my voice for the first time since the reading began. I've been working in construction-related consulting for 8 years. I understand building systems, environmental regulations, and sustainable practices that are becoming mandatory for new construction projects. Marcus whirled around to face me, his expression filled with contempt. Consulting isn't building. Sarah, you've never managed a construction crew, never dealt with subcontractors, never had to deliver a project on time and under budget. You have no idea what it takes to actually run Morrison Construction, which is why Dad arranged for transition support and advisory oversight, I replied, my confidence growing as I began to grasp the wisdom of Dad's planning. He didn't just hand me the keys and wish me luck. He created a structure that combines my expertise in sustainable practices with operational experience from existing management. Grace stood up beside Marcus, her carefully composed funeral demeanor cracking under the stress of watching their expected inheritance disappear. This is going to destroy the company, she said, her voice shrill with panic. Sarah, you have to understand, you're not ready for this kind of responsibility. Mr. Henderson intervened before I could respond. If I may, he said, opening one of the sealed envelopes, your father anticipated these concerns and asked me to share some additional information that influenced his decision. He pulled out several sheets of paper and what appeared to be a financial report. Over the past 18 months, Robert conducted a thorough audit of Morrison Construction's finances and operations. He discovered several irregularities in project management and financial reporting that raised serious questions about current leadership capabilities. Marcus went very still, his anger replaced by something approaching fear. "What kind of irregularities?" he asked, but his voice had lost its previous confidence. "Systematic overcharging of clients for materials and labor, with the excess being diverted to personal accounts," Mr. Henderson read from the document. "Fraudulent billing for subcontractor work that was never performed. Kickback arrangements with suppliers in exchange for inflated pricing, and misappropriation of company funds for personal expenses disguised as business costs." The room became tomb quiet as the implications sank in. Marcus had been stealing from Morrison Construction, probably for years, thinking Dad was too sick and distracted to notice discrepancies in the books. "The total amount involved appears to be approximately $400,000 over the past 3 years, the attorney continued. "Your father chose to handle this matter through the estate rather than pursuing criminal charges, primarily to protect the company's reputation and the jobs of innocent employees." Marcus collapsed back onto the couch, his face gray with shock and defeat. Grace stared at him with dawning horror, clearly realizing that their financial problems went far beyond losing an expected inheritance. "However, Mr. Henderson said, any attempt to challenge the will or interfere with Morrison Construction's operations will result in these findings being turned over to the district attorney's office for potential prosecution." Your father hoped that Marcus might use this opportunity to reflect on his choices and find a more ethical path forward. I felt a mix of vindication and sadness as I watched my brother's carefully constructed image of competent leadership crumble. For years he'd portrayed my environmental work as impractical idealism while positioning himself as the pragmatic businessman. Now it was clear that his practical approach had included systematic theft and fraud. "Sarah," Mr. Henderson said, turning his attention back to me, "your father left you several personal letters along with detailed recommendations for Morrison Construction's future. He was particularly excited about the possibility of the company becoming a leader in sustainable construction and green building certification. He handed me a thick envelope with my name written in Dad's careful handwriting. Just seeing his familiar penmanship made my eyes fill with tears again. He also wanted me to emphasize that he doesn't expect you to abandon your environmental consulting work entirely. He believed that your outside perspective and industry connections would actually strengthen Morrison Construction's ability to innovate and adapt to changing market conditions." I stared at the envelope, still struggling to accept the magnitude of what had just happened. An hour ago, I'd been the family failure driving back to Portland to escape another humiliating gathering. Now I was inheriting a multi-million-dollar construction company and the opportunity to implement the sustainable building practices I'd been passionate about for years. "There's one more thing," Mr. Henderson said, pulling out a final document. "Your father established a separate fund to support the transition and ensure Morrison Construction can invest in new equipment and training for sustainable construction practices. The amount available is $200,000 specifically earmarked for environmental upgrades and green building certification processes." Marcus looked up from his hands with desperate hope. "Does that mean there's a role for me in the new structure? I mean, I know the operational side better than anyone else." I studied my brother's face, seeing genuine fear beneath his previous arrogance. Despite everything he'd said and done, despite the theft and contempt, he was still family. But I also understood why Dad had made his decision so definitively. "Marcus," I said carefully, "I need to understand the full extent of the financial irregularities before I can make any decisions about staffing or management roles. Dad's advisors will help me assess what kind of operational changes are necessary." "I can explain everything," he said quickly. "The money issues, I can pay it all back. I just made some mistakes, got in over my head with some investments. It wasn't malicious, just poor judgment." Mr. Henderson looked at me meaningfully. "Sarah, your father's documentation is quite extensive. I think you'll find that the patterns suggest more than simple poor judgment." The weight of responsibility was beginning to settle on my shoulders like a heavy coat. Morrison Construction wasn't just a business, it was the livelihood for hundreds of people and their families. The decisions I made over the coming months would affect not just my own future but the economic stability of an entire community. "I need time to process all of this," I said finally. "Mr. Henderson, when do I need to make decisions about company operations?" "Your father recommended taking at least 30 days to review all the documentation and meet with the advisory board before making any major changes," he replied. The transition fund will cover operational expenses during that period, and the existing project managers can maintain day-to-day operations. Marcus stood up slowly, looking defeated and lost. I guess I should clean out my office, he said quietly. Not necessarily, I replied, surprising myself with the response. But we need complete transparency about the financial issues, and we need to discuss whether there's a role for you that doesn't involve financial authority or client relations until trust can be rebuilt. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it wasn't complete rejection either. Despite everything, Marcus was still my brother, and Dad's letter might contain guidance about handling family relationships alongside business responsibilities. Grace gathered her purse and coat with shaking hands. We should go, she said to Marcus. Let Sarah process everything without us hovering around. As the room began to empty, our relatives offering awkward congratulations and confused condolences, I found myself alone with Mr. Henderson and the overwhelming reality of my new situation. Sarah, the attorney said gently, your father spent months preparing for this transition. He didn't make these decisions lightly, and he provided extensive support systems to help you succeed. You don't have to figure everything out immediately. I nodded, clutching Dad's letter and trying to imagine walking into Morrison Construction's offices as the owner rather than the family member who'd chosen a different path. The irony wasn't lost on me that Dad's final gift would require me to combine everything I'd learned about sustainable building practices with the construction industry expertise I'd spent years avoiding. There's one more thing he wanted me to tell you, Mr. Henderson added. He said to remember that Morrison Construction was built on innovation and adaptation. When he started the company in 1972, sustainable building wasn't even a concept, but he believed that successful businesses evolve with changing times and new knowledge. As I drove back to Portland that evening, Dad's letter unopened on the passenger seat, I began to understand that my inheritance wasn't just about money or business ownership. It was about proving that my environmental expertise had always been valuable, that sustainable construction practices weren't idealistic theories but practical necessities for the industry's future. The real question wasn't whether I could learn to run Morrison Construction, but whether I could transform it into the kind of company I'd always believed it could become while honoring the legacy Dad had spent 50 years building. For the first time in my adult life, I had the opportunity to prove that being different from my family didn't mean being less valuable to our shared future. Opening Dad's letter at 3 in the morning in my Portland apartment felt like stepping into a conversation I'd been waiting my entire life to have. The familiar handwriting, slightly shaky from his illness but still distinctly his, covered 8 pages of personal stationery. I made a cup of tea and settled into my reading chair, the same one where I'd studied for my engineering finals years ago, and began to read the most important document of my life. My dearest Sarah, the letter began. If you're reading this, then the will reading went exactly as I planned, and you're probably sitting somewhere feeling overwhelmed, confused, and maybe a little angry at me for putting you in this position. I understand all of those feelings, and I want you to know that every decision I made was based on careful observation, thorough research, and deep love for both you and Morrison Construction. Dad's voice came through so clearly in the written words that I could almost hear him speaking. He'd always been thoughtful in his communication, measuring his words carefully whether he was negotiating a contract or explaining a construction concept to a curious daughter. First, I want to apologize for not defending your work and your vision more forcefully when we were still trying to find your place in our family dynamic. I allowed myself to be influenced by traditional thinking and family pressure when I should have been listening to your expertise. The truth is, Sarah, you were right about almost everything you tried to tell us about sustainable construction, environmental regulations, and the future of the building industry. The admission hit me harder than I'd expected. For years I'd wondered if Dad truly understood what I was trying to accomplish with my environmental consulting work, or if he saw it as an elaborate way of avoiding the family business. Reading his acknowledgement of my expertise felt like a healing balm on wounds I'd carried for nearly a decade. Over the past 18 months, while dealing with my diagnosis and watching how the family responded to the prospect of my death, I had time to really investigate the claims you made in that presentation 3 years ago. I hired 2 independent consulting firms to analyze Morrison Construction's current practices and assess the market trends you'd identified. What I learned convinced me that you weren't just right about the direction the industry was heading, you were probably conservative in your timeline estimates. Dad went on to detail his research findings, explaining how he discovered that cities across Oregon and Washington were implementing increasingly strict environmental building codes, that major corporations were requiring LEED certification for new construction projects, and that federal tax incentives for green building were creating substantial competitive advantages for companies that embraced sustainable practices. Morrison Construction has been operating essentially the same way since 1985, he wrote. We've been successful because we built a reputation for quality and reliability, but we haven't innovated or adapted to changing market conditions. The contracts we're winning now are increasingly with smaller local clients who aren't demanding environmental compliance. The major commercial and residential developers are working with firms that can offer green building expertise. This revelation explains something that had puzzled me during my weekend visits over the past year. Despite Marcus's confident reports about Morrison Construction's success, I'd noticed that the projects Dad mentioned seemed smaller in scope than the major developments the company had tackled during my childhood. At the time, I'd assumed Dad was just sharing the details he thought would be most interesting to me, but apparently the shift reflected a real decline in the company's market position. I also spent considerable time documenting Marcus's behavior and decision-making during my illness. The letter continued, and Dad's tone became more serious. What I observed troubled me deeply, not just because of the financial irregularities you heard about today, but because of his fundamental approach to leadership and problem-solving. Dad described watching Marcus respond to challenges during the past year, noting his tendency to blame external factors rather than adapting to changing conditions, his dismissal of input from employees with different perspectives, and his increasing reliance on short-term financial manipulation rather than sustainable business practices. The money Marcus took from the company wasn't just theft, it was symptomatic of a deeper problem with his judgment and character. When faced with personal financial pressure, he chose deception and fraud over honest communication about his situation. When employees suggested more efficient approaches to project management, he dismissed their input as disloyalty. When clients asked about environmental compliance options, he told them those services were unnecessary complications. Reading Dad's careful documentation of Marcus's failures felt both validating and sad. My brother had positioned himself as the practical businessman while painting me as an idealistic dreamer, but Dad's investigation had revealed that Marcus's approach was actually the more impractical one, based on outdated assumptions and resistant to necessary change. Sarah, I'm entrusting Morrison Construction to you because you have demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking the company needs to survive and thrive over the next 50 years. Your expertise in environmental systems isn't a nice addition to traditional construction knowledge, it's the foundation that all future construction will be built on. Your experience working with diverse clients and complex regulatory requirements has prepared you for the challenges Morrison Construction will face as environmental standards become more stringent. The letter went on to outline Dad's vision for the company's transformation, including specific recommendations for pursuing LEED certification capabilities, investing in energy-efficient construction equipment, and developing partnerships with renewable energy installers and sustainable material suppliers. His research had been extensive, including financial projections showing how green building expertise could increase Morrison Construction's profit margins while opening access to larger, more prestigious projects. I've also arranged for you to work with Janet Kumar, a business consultant who specializes in helping traditional construction companies transition to sustainable practices. Janet has successfully guided 12 companies through similar transformations over the past 5 years, and she's familiar with the regulatory environment in Oregon and Washington. Her contact information is included with this letter, and I've already paid for 6 months of consulting services. Learning about this level of preparation made me realize that Dad's decision to leave me the company wasn't an impulsive gesture or an emotional reaction to Marcus's behavior. He'd spent months developing a comprehensive plan for Morrison Construction's future, and he'd concluded that my background made me the best person to execute that plan. The advisory board I've established will provide operational expertise while you're learning the day-to-day management aspects of the business. Tom Rodriguez, our senior project manager, has 40 years of construction experience and has been quietly researching sustainable building practices on his own initiative. Linda Chen, our chief financial officer, has been concerned about the company's market position for several years and has ideas about financial restructuring that could support the transition to green building focus. Reading about Tom and Linda's involvement gave me hope that I wouldn't be completely alone in trying to transform Morrison Construction. I'd met both of them numerous times over the years during family gatherings and company events, and I'd always been impressed by their competence and integrity. Knowing that they'd been thinking about similar changes independently suggested that Dad's vision aligned with broader concerns within the company. The most important thing I want you to understand, Sarah, is that I'm not asking you to abandon everything you've built in your environmental consulting career. Your outside perspective and industry connections are actually advantages that will help Morrison Construction succeed in ways that purely internal development couldn't achieve. You understand client needs and regulatory requirements that most construction companies are still learning about. This point addressed one of my biggest concerns about accepting the inheritance. Pacific Environmental Solutions had been more than just a job for me, it had been my professional identity and the foundation of my expertise. The idea of giving up environmental consulting to become a construction company owner had felt like betraying everything I'd worked to accomplish. I've spoken with your current clients at Pacific Environmental Solutions, and several of them have expressed interest in working with Morrison Construction on future projects if we can offer integrated construction and environmental services. This could be a significant competitive advantage, allowing us to provide clients with comprehensive project management from initial environmental assessment through final construction and certification. Dad had been busy during his final months, apparently conducting informal market research with my own client base. The idea of combining environmental consulting with construction services was brilliant, offering clients a one-stop solution for projects that needed both traditional building expertise and environmental compliance. Regarding Marcus, I want you to know that my decision to limit his inheritance wasn't motivated by anger or disappointment but by realistic assessment of his capabilities and character. The financial irregularities were serious, but more concerning was his consistent refusal to acknowledge changing market conditions or consider alternative approaches to business challenges. Dad's analysis of Marcus was clinical and thorough, describing specific incidents where my brother had made decisions based on pride or stubbornness rather than sound business judgment. He documented conversations where Marcus had dismissed client requests for environmental features as trendy nonsense and employee suggestions for efficiency improvements as unnecessary complications. However, I also believe that people can change and grow when they're confronted with the consequences of their choices. If Marcus demonstrates genuine commitment to ethical behavior and willingness to learn new approaches, there may be a role for him in Morrison Construction's future. That decision will be yours to make based on his actions over the coming months. This guidance about Marcus felt like the most challenging aspect of my inheritance. Despite his contempt for my work and his financial crimes, he was still my brother, and he did have extensive operational knowledge that could be valuable. But Dad was right that any future involvement would have to be based on demonstrated change in his character and approach. I'm also including detailed financial records for Morrison Construction, including the documentation of Marcus's theft and misappropriation of funds. You'll need this information to clean up the company's books and ensure that all client accounts are properly reconciled. Linda Chen has been aware of the irregularities and has been quietly preparing corrected financial statements. The business documentation Dad had prepared was extensive, including 3 ring binders full of financial records, project summaries, employee evaluations, and market analysis. He'd essentially created a comprehensive business school case study of Morrison Construction's current situation and future opportunities. Sarah, I know this inheritance comes with enormous responsibility and pressure. You're inheriting not just a business, but the livelihoods of over 200 employees and their families. I wouldn't have made this decision if I wasn't completely confident in your ability to honor that responsibility while transforming the company into something even better than what I built. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing as I read Dad's words. Morrison Construction wasn't just about my own career or family relationships, it was about preserving jobs and maintaining the economic stability of a significant portion of Willow Creek's workforce. The pressure to succeed felt almost paralyzing. But I also want you to remember why I started Morrison Construction in the first place. After Vietnam, I needed to build something positive and lasting, something that would improve people's lives and communities. The buildings we constructed weren't just structures, they were homes where families would grow, schools where children would learn, offices where people would build careers. The purpose was always bigger than the business itself. Reading about Dad's original motivation reminded me why I'd been drawn to environmental consulting in the first place. I wanted to help create buildings and communities that would be sustainable and healthy for generations, just as Dad had wanted to create structures that would last and serve their communities well. Your vision for sustainable construction aligns perfectly with that original purpose, Sarah. Green buildings aren't just environmentally responsible, they're healthier for the people who live and work in them, more cost-effective over their lifetime, and better integrated with their communities. By leading Morrison Construction towards sustainable practices, you'll be honoring our original mission while adapting it for the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. The letter concluded with practical advice about the transition process, including a timeline for implementing changes, key employees to rely on during the learning phase, and specific projects that could serve as pilot programs for demonstrating Morrison Construction's new capabilities. Take your time learning the operational aspects of the business, but don't hesitate to implement your environmental expertise immediately. The construction industry is changing rapidly, and companies that wait too long to adapt will find themselves left behind. Morrison Construction has a 50-year reputation for quality and integrity, which gives you a strong foundation for building something new and better. Dad's final paragraphs were deeply personal, expressing his pride in my accomplishments, his confidence in my abilities, and his love for both me and Marcus despite the difficulties of the past few years. I wish I could be there to see what you'll build with Morrison Construction, but I'm confident it will be something special. Trust your expertise, rely on good people, and remember that the best legacy anyone can leave is work that makes the world a little bit better. All my love, Dad. I sat in my reading chair for another hour after finishing the letter, processing the magnitude of what Dad had entrusted to me, and beginning to formulate a mental plan for approaching the transition. The sun was beginning to rise over Portland, and I realized I needed to call Pacific Environmental Solutions to explain my situation and begin the complex process of transitioning my client relationships. My first call was to Janet Kumar, the business consultant Dad had arranged. Her voicemail greeting was professional and warm, and I left a message explaining who I was and asking to schedule an initial consultation as soon as possible. According to Dad's notes, Janet specialized in exactly the kind of transformation Morrison Construction needed, and her experience would be invaluable during the early stages of taking control. The second call was more difficult. I needed to speak with my boss at Pacific Environmental Solutions about my inheritance and the possibility of maintaining some consulting relationships while taking over Morrison Construction. The conversation would require delicate handling, since I didn't want to burn bridges with colleagues who'd supported my career development. Before making that call, I decided to drive down to Willow Creek and visit Morrison Construction's offices for the first time as the owner rather than just Marcus's sister. I needed to see the physical facility, meet with the advisory board Dad had established, and begin understanding the day-to-day operations that would now be my responsibility. The drive to Willow Creek gave me time to think about how dramatically my life had changed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday morning, I'd been Sarah Morrison, environmental consultant, driving to her father's funeral, and dreading another family gathering, where she'd be treated as the impractical idealist. Today I was Sarah Morrison, owner of a multi-million-dollar construction company, responsible for preserving jobs and transforming an industry. Morrison Construction's main office was located in a converted warehouse complex on the outskirts of Willow Creek, surrounded by equipment yards and maintenance buildings. I'd visited the facility numerous times during my childhood, but I'd never paid attention to the business operations or management structure. Now I needed to understand every aspect of how the company functioned. Tom Rodriguez was waiting for me in the main office, having received a call from Mr. Henderson about the will reading results.
His weathered face showed a mixture of sympathy for my loss and curiosity about my plans for the company. Tom had started working for Dad as a teenager, and had worked his way up from general laborer to senior project manager over 4 decades. "Sarah, I want you to know that I'm glad your father made this decision," he said as we shook hands in the lobby. "Morrison Construction needs new thinking if we're going to stay competitive, and your environmental background could be exactly what we need." His immediate support meant more to me than I could express. Tom's opinion carried significant weight with the construction crews and subcontractors, and his endorsement would make my transition much smoother. "I appreciate that, Tom, but I have to admit I'm feeling pretty overwhelmed by the operational side of things. I understand building systems and environmental compliance, but I've never managed construction crews or dealt with the daily logistics of multiple projects." "That's what the advisory board is for," he replied. "Your father was smart to set up support systems. Linda Chen has been running the financial side of things for years, and she's got ideas about improving our profit margins and cash flow management. Mike Patterson handles our largest commercial contracts and knows all the major clients personally. Between the 3 of us, we can handle the operational details while you focus on the strategic direction."
Meeting with Linda Chen and Mike Patterson that afternoon reinforced my confidence that Dad had chosen his advisory board wisely. Linda had been concerned about Morrison Construction's financial trajectory for several years and had been quietly researching sustainable construction market opportunities. Mike had noticed that larger clients were increasingly requesting environmental compliance capabilities and had been frustrated by the company's inability to offer those services. The truth is, Sarah, we've been losing contracts to competitors who can provide integrated environmental and construction services, Linda explained as we reviewed financial reports in the conference room. Your father's decision to focus on traditional methods was limiting our growth potential, especially in the commercial development market. Mike nodded in agreement. I've had 3 major clients in the past year ask specifically about LEED certification capabilities and renewable energy integration. We had to refer those projects to other firms because we couldn't offer the environmental expertise they needed. Learning about these lost opportunities made me realize that Dad's vision for Morrison Construction wasn't just theoretically sound, it was practically necessary for the company's survival. The market was already demanding the kind of integrated services that my background would allow us to provide. What about the workforce? I asked. How do you think the crews will respond to changes in our approach and focus? Tom considered the question carefully. Most of our people are professionals who take pride in quality work. If you can show them that sustainable practices improve the final product and increase job security, they'll embrace the changes. The younger workers especially are interested in learning new techniques and technologies. There might be some resistance from supervisors who've been doing things the same way for 20 years, Linda added, but I think most of that will disappear once they see that the changes are improving our competitiveness and profitability. We spent the rest of the afternoon touring the equipment yards and maintenance facilities, with Tom explaining the company's current capabilities and identifying areas where investments in new technology could support sustainable construction practices. The facility was well maintained and efficiently organized, but I could see opportunities for upgrades that would allow us to offer services like solar panel installation and geothermal system integration. My phone rang as we were wrapping up the facility tour. Janet Kumar was returning my call and could meet the following morning to begin discussing Morrison Construction's transformation strategy. Her voice was confident and professional, and she seemed genuinely excited about the opportunity to work with a company that had strong operational foundations and clear vision for sustainable growth. Based on what you've described, she said, Morrison Construction is actually in an ideal position for this kind of transition. You have established client relationships, experienced management, and financial resources to invest in new capabilities. The biggest challenge will be coordinating the cultural change with the operational changes, but that's definitely manageable with proper planning. That evening, I called Marcus to discuss his role in Morrison Construction's future. The conversation was awkward and tense, but necessary for establishing clear expectations and boundaries. He'd spent the day processing the reality of his situation and seemed genuinely shaken by the exposure of his financial crimes. Sarah, I know you have every right to fire me completely, he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. I made serious mistakes and I understand why Dad lost faith in my judgment. Marcus, I'm not interested in punishment or revenge, I replied. But I need complete honesty about the financial irregularities, and I need to see genuine commitment to ethical behavior before I can consider any ongoing role for you in the company. We arranged to meet later in the week to go through the financial documentation together and discuss possible positions that wouldn't involve authority over company funds or client relationships. Despite everything that had happened, Marcus did have operational knowledge that could be valuable, but rebuilding trust would require consistent demonstration of changed behavior. The next morning's meeting with Janet Kumar was revelatory. She'd reviewed Morrison Construction's financial statements and market position overnight and had already developed preliminary recommendations for the transformation process. Your father did excellent research, she said, as we sat in a coffee shop near Morrison Construction's offices. The market analysis is thorough and accurate, and the financial foundation is strong enough to support significant changes. The key will be implementing sustainable practices in a way that builds on existing strengths rather than abandoning them. Janet outlined a phased approach that would allow Morrison Construction to begin offering environmental services immediately while gradually expanding capabilities and staff expertise. The plan included specific timelines for obtaining LEED certification credentials, investing in new equipment for renewable energy installations, and developing partnerships with environmental consulting firms.
The beautiful thing about your situation, she explained, is that you already have the environmental expertise that most construction companies are scrambling to acquire. Instead of hiring outside consultants or sending existing staff for training, you can immediately begin offering integrated services that combine construction and environmental compliance. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time since the will reading, I began to feel excited rather than overwhelmed by the prospect of transforming Morrison Construction. Janet's experience with similar transitions gave me confidence that the challenges were manageable and that the opportunities were even larger than Dad had envisioned. Over the following weeks, I worked with Janet and the advisory board to develop a comprehensive transformation plan for Morrison Construction. The strategy balanced respect for the company's traditional strengths with bold changes necessary for future competitiveness. We identified pilot projects that could demonstrate our new capabilities, developed training programs for existing employees, and created marketing materials that positioned Morrison Construction as a leader in sustainable building practices. The response from Morrison Construction's existing clients was overwhelmingly positive. Several companies that had been working with other firms for environmental compliance expressed immediate interest in consolidating their construction and environmental services with us. The integrated approach offered them cost savings and simplified project management while giving us access to larger, more profitable contracts. 3 months after inheriting Morrison Construction, I stood in the main office reviewing progress reports that would have seemed impossible the day of Dad's funeral. We'd secured 2 major commercial contracts, specifically because of our environmental expertise, increased our profit margins by 15% through more efficient project management, and begun training programs that had energized the entire workforce. Marcus had earned a limited role as an equipment maintenance supervisor, a position that utilized his operational knowledge without giving him authority over finances or client relationships. The arrangement was working well, and he seemed genuinely committed to rebuilding trust through consistent ethical behavior. Most importantly, Morrison Construction was becoming exactly the kind of company I'd always believed it could be: a leader in sustainable construction that honored Dad's legacy of quality and integrity, while embracing the environmental responsibility that would define the industry's future. The transformation wasn't complete, but the foundation was solid, and the direction was clear. Standing in Dad's old office, which I'd made my own with the addition of environmental engineering references and sustainable building awards, I realized that his final gift hadn't just been the inheritance of a business. He'd given me the opportunity to prove that my expertise had always been valuable, that sustainable construction practices weren't idealistic theories but practical necessities, and that being different from my family didn't mean being less capable of honoring our shared legacy. 6 months into my tenure as Morrison Construction's owner, the real test of Dad's faith in me arrived in the form of the Cascade Commons project, a $12 million mixed-use development that would either establish our reputation as leaders in sustainable construction or prove that Marcus had been right about my impractical idealism all along. The client, Pemberton Development Group, had issued a request for proposals that specifically required LEED Gold certification, solar energy integration, and innovative water management systems. It was exactly the kind of project that Morrison Construction had been unable to bid on under the old management structure. The proposal deadline was 6 weeks away, and winning the contract would require demonstrating capabilities we were still developing while competing against established firms that had been offering environmental services for years. Janet Kumar warned me that taking on such an ambitious project so early in our transformation could be risky, but I knew this was our opportunity to prove that Morrison Construction's evolution wasn't just theoretical. The Pemberton RFP landed on my desk on a Tuesday morning when I was already dealing with 3 other crisis situations that had tested my leadership abilities in ways business school case studies couldn't have prepared me for. Our largest current project, a medical office complex in Bend, had encountered unexpected soil contamination that required immediate environmental remediation. 2 of our most experienced foremen had given notice after accepting positions with competitors who offered higher wages and better benefits. And Marcus had been arrested for driving under the influence, creating a public relations nightmare that threatened to undermine the credibility we'd been working to rebuild. Tom Rodriguez knocked on my office door just as I finished reading the Pemberton RFP for the 3rd time, trying to calculate whether we could realistically deliver everything they were requesting within their timeline and budget constraints. "Sarah, we need to talk about the Bend project," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the grim expression he reserved for serious problems. The environmental assessment came back, and we're looking at significant contamination remediation before we can pour the foundation. The soil contamination wasn't anyone's fault. It was apparently the result of dry cleaning chemicals that had leaked from a business that operated on the site 30 years earlier. But dealing with it properly would require specialized environmental cleanup that could delay the project by months and increase costs beyond what our contract allowed. What are our options? I asked, pushing the Pemberton RFP aside to focus on the immediate crisis. The traditional approach would be to notify the client about the delay and negotiate a contract modification to cover the additional costs, Tom explained. But that could damage our relationship with the client and hurt our reputation for on-time delivery. I stared at the environmental assessment report, recognizing an opportunity to demonstrate exactly the kind of integrated thinking that Dad had believed would distinguish Morrison Construction from our competitors. Instead of treating the contamination as an obstacle, we could approach it as a chance to showcase our environmental expertise while maintaining our construction schedule. What if we handle the remediation ourselves, instead of subcontracting it? I asked. I have experience with soil contamination projects from my consulting work, and we could potentially save money while maintaining better control over the timeline. Tom looked skeptical. Sarah, environmental remediation requires specialized equipment and certification. We don't have those capabilities in-house. Not yet, I agreed, but I've been planning to expand our environmental services anyway. This could be the perfect opportunity to accelerate that timeline and prove our capabilities to a client who's already working with us. Over the next hour, Tom and I developed a plan that would allow Morrison Construction to handle the soil remediation internally while staying on schedule for the medical office construction. It would require purchasing specialized equipment, obtaining additional environmental permits, and bringing in temporary technical support, but the approach would ultimately save the client money while demonstrating our unique capabilities. The strategy worked better than I'd dared to hope. Not only did we complete the remediation ahead of schedule, but the client was so impressed with our integrated approach that they recommended Morrison Construction to 2 other medical groups planning similar facilities. Word spread quickly through the construction industry about our ability to handle complex environmental challenges without relying on multiple subcontractors. The success of the Bend project gave me the confidence to pursue the Cascade Commons proposal aggressively. I assembled a team that combined Morrison Construction's traditional expertise with cutting-edge environmental design capabilities, partnering with a renewable energy specialist and a water management consultant to create a comprehensive approach that exceeded Pemberton's requirements. The proposal preparation process revealed how much Morrison Construction had changed since Dad's death. Instead of viewing environmental compliance as a burden to be minimized, our team approached sustainability features as opportunities to create value for the client while showcasing our technical capabilities. The project managers, who had initially been skeptical about green building practices, were now contributing innovative ideas about energy efficiency and resource conservation. Chen had restructured our financial systems to track the profitability of environmental services separately from traditional construction work, and the results were impressive. Projects that incorporated sustainable design elements generated profit margins 25% higher than conventional construction, primarily because clients were willing to pay premium prices for integrated services that simplified their project management. The market research your father conducted was actually conservative, Linda told me during one of our weekly financial reviews. Demand for environmental construction services is growing faster than his projections suggested, and our early entry into this market is giving us significant competitive advantages. The numbers supported Dad's vision more dramatically than even he had anticipated. Morrison Construction's reputation for environmental expertise was attracting clients who valued sustainability but also demanded the operational reliability that we'd built over 50 years. We were uniquely positioned to serve customers who wanted both innovation and dependability. Mike Patterson had been equally successful in expanding our client relationships. His existing contacts in the commercial development industry were eager to work with a construction firm that could handle environmental compliance internally, and several long-term clients had increased their project volume with us specifically because of our new capabilities. The Pemberton project could be a game changer for us, Mike explained as we reviewed the proposal draft. They're one of the most influential development companies in the Pacific Northwest, and they specifically requested firms that could demonstrate leadership in sustainable construction. Winning this contract would establish us as a serious player in the green building market. The proposal process required skills I'd never developed during my environmental consulting career. Writing technical specifications and environmental compliance plans was familiar territory, but creating project timelines, managing subcontractor relationships, and calculating construction costs required expertise that I was still learning from Tom and Mike. Janet Kumar helped me understand how to present Morrison Construction's transformation as a strategic advantage rather than a work in progress. Instead of apologizing for being new to integrated environmental construction, we positioned our approach as innovative and client-focused, emphasizing our ability to provide personalized service and customized solutions. The key is to show Pemberton that your environmental background gives Morrison Construction capabilities that traditional firms are scrambling to develop. Janet explained during one of our strategy sessions. You're not trying to become like your competitors, you're demonstrating why they should be trying to become like you. This perspective helped me frame the proposal in terms that highlighted our unique strengths while addressing potential concerns about our limited experience with large-scale sustainable projects. We included detailed case studies from the Bend Medical Office project and 2 smaller residential developments where we'd successfully integrated environmental and construction services. The proposal submission process was more nerve-wracking than any environmental assessment I'd ever conducted. Morrison Construction's future depended not just on winning the Cascade Commons contract, but on proving that our transformation strategy could compete successfully against firms with longer track records in sustainable construction. Pemberton's response came 3 weeks later in the form of a phone call from their senior development manager, requesting a presentation meeting to discuss our proposal in detail. The fact that we'd made it through the initial screening felt like a victory, but I knew the real test would be demonstrating our capabilities in person to a panel of development professionals who would be evaluating our technical expertise and project management capacity. The presentation meeting was scheduled for the following Friday at Pemberton's corporate headquarters in Seattle. I would have 90 minutes to convince a panel of 6 executives that Morrison Construction could deliver a $12 million sustainable development project, despite being a traditionally focused firm that had only recently expanded into environmental services. I spent the week before the presentation practicing with Tom, Mike, and Linda, anticipating questions about our project management capabilities, subcontractor relationships, and financial stability. Janet Kumar conducted mock interviews that prepared me for skeptical questions about my transition from environmental consulting to construction management. Remember that you're not just selling Morrison Construction services, Janet reminded me. You're selling a vision of integrated construction that combines traditional building expertise with cutting-edge environmental design. Pemberton specifically requested that approach, which means they already believe it's valuable. The night before the presentation, I reviewed Dad's letter one more time, drawing confidence from his belief that Morrison Construction's future depended on exactly the kind of project we were competing for. He'd envisioned the company becoming a leader in sustainable construction, and the Cascade Commons contract would either validate that vision or prove that the transformation had been premature. The Pemberton offices occupied 3 floors of a LEED Platinum building in downtown Seattle, a detail that reinforced how seriously they took environmental sustainability. The presentation room featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, and the conference table was made from reclaimed wood that had been salvaged from a demolished warehouse. The development panel included Pemberton's senior managers, along with their environmental consultant and the architect who had designed Cascade Commons. I recognized the environmental consultant, Dr. Patricia Hoffman, from industry conferences where I'd presented research on building energy efficiency. Her presence suggested that Pemberton took the technical aspects of sustainable construction very seriously. My presentation began with an overview of Morrison Construction's 50-year history and our recent transformation to focus on integrated environmental services. I explained how my background in environmental consulting complemented the company's traditional construction expertise, creating capabilities that were uniquely suited to projects like Cascade Commons. Morrison Construction offers something that pure construction firms and pure environmental consultants cannot provide, I told the panel. We understand both the building process and the environmental systems that need to be integrated throughout that process. This allows us to identify opportunities and solve problems that become apparent only when you have expertise in both areas. Hoffman asked the first technical question, inquiring about our approach to achieving LED Gold certification while maintaining cost control and construction efficiency. I'd anticipated this question and had prepared detailed examples from our recent projects showing how environmental features could actually reduce construction costs when integrated properly into the building design. The key is designing environmental systems as integral components of the building rather than add-on features, I explained, using diagrams to show how proper planning could allow solar panel installation to serve both energy generation and roofing functions. When environmental features are incorporated from the beginning of the design process, they often provide cost savings that offset their installation expenses. The presentation continued for an hour, with panel members asking increasingly detailed questions about project scheduling, subcontractor management, and quality control procedures. Tom Rodriguez had helped me prepare comprehensive answers that demonstrated Morrison Construction's operational capabilities while highlighting our unique environmental expertise. The most challenging question came from Pemberton's senior development manager, who asked directly about my limited experience managing large construction projects. It was the concern I'd been most worried about, and I knew my answer would determine whether Morrison Construction would be seriously considered for the contract. You're absolutely right that I haven't managed a $12 million construction project before, I said, deciding that honesty was more effective than trying to minimize the experience gap. But I have managed complex environmental projects with comparable budgets and regulatory requirements, and I've assembled a team that combines my environmental expertise with 40 years of construction management experience. I explained how Tom Rodriguez would serve as senior project manager, while I focused on environmental compliance and client relations, creating a management structure that utilized everyone's strongest capabilities. The approach demonstrated that I understood the limitations of my experience, while showing how Morrison Construction's team structure addressed those concerns. The panel spent 20 minutes asking specific questions about project timelines, resource allocation, and contingency planning. Tom had prepared me well for these operational details, and I could see the panel members becoming more confident in our ability to deliver the project successfully. Dr. Hoffman's final question was about innovation, asking what Morrison Construction would bring to Cascade Commons that other firms couldn't provide. This was my opportunity to articulate the vision that Dad had believed would distinguish our company from traditional competitors. We approach sustainable construction as an integrated discipline rather than a collection of separate specialties, I explained. Instead of hiring environmental consultants to design systems that construction crews then install, we design and build environmental features as unified components of the overall project. This integration typically results in better performance, lower costs, and fewer problems during construction. The presentation concluded with my commitment that Morrison Construction would treat Cascade Commons not just as a construction project, but as a demonstration of what sustainable development could achieve when environmental expertise and construction excellence were truly integrated.
The panel thanked me for the presentation and indicated that they would make their decision within 2 weeks. The waiting period was agony, filled with second-guessing every answer I'd given and wondering whether Morrison Construction's transformation had been too ambitious too quickly. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon while I was reviewing environmental permits for a residential solar installation project. Pemberton's senior development manager delivered the news with professional formality that gradually gave way to genuine enthusiasm. Morrison Construction has been selected for the Cascade Commons project, he said. The panel was impressed by your integrated approach and believes that your environmental expertise will ensure the project meets our sustainability goals while maintaining construction quality and efficiency. The relief and excitement I felt was overwhelming, but the development manager's next comments made it clear that winning the contract was just the beginning of the real challenge. I want to emphasize that this project will be closely watched by the development community, he continued. Cascade Commons represents a significant investment in sustainable construction, and its success or failure will influence how similar projects are approached throughout the region. Morrison Construction's performance will be scrutinized by competitors, clients, and industry observers. The pressure was immense, but it was also exactly the opportunity that Dad had envisioned for Morrison Construction. We would have the chance to prove that integrated environmental construction wasn't just theoretical but practical and profitable when executed by a team that understood both building and environmental systems.
The contract signing ceremony took place 2 weeks later at Morrison Construction's offices, with Pemberton's executives touring our facilities and meeting the team that would be responsible for delivering Cascade Commons. The visit went well, with Tom Rodriguez impressing the clients with his detailed knowledge of construction logistics and Linda Chen demonstrating our financial management capabilities. Marcus attended the ceremony in his capacity as equipment maintenance supervisor, and I was pleased to see him interacting professionally with the Pemberton representatives. His behavior over the past months had shown genuine commitment to rebuilding trust, and his operational knowledge was valuable even in his limited role. The media coverage of the contract announcement exceeded my expectations, with trade publications highlighting Morrison Construction's transformation and positioning Cascade Commons as a test case for integrated environmental construction. The attention was both exciting and intimidating, reinforcing the high stakes involved in proving that Dad's vision for the company's future had been correct. Construction on Cascade Commons began 3 months later with a groundbreaking ceremony that attracted representatives from throughout the sustainable construction industry. Dr. Hoffman gave a presentation about the project's environmental features, crediting Morrison Construction's integrated approach with making several innovative design elements possible. The first phase of construction proceeded smoothly, with our crews adapting quickly to the environmental requirements that were integrated throughout the building process. The younger workers especially embraced the challenge of learning new techniques for installing renewable energy systems and water management features. Tom Rodriguez proved to be an exceptional project manager, coordinating the complex scheduling required to integrate environmental systems with traditional construction activities. His experience and leadership kept the project on schedule while maintaining the quality standards that Morrison Construction was known for. 6 months into the Cascade Commons construction, Morrison Construction was operating as a completely different company than the one Dad had left me. We employed 50 more people than at the time of his death, had a project backlog that extended 18 months into the future, and were generating profit margins that exceeded anything the company had achieved under traditional construction-only services. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. 2 veteran supervisors had left the company because they were uncomfortable with the changes, and we'd had to invest significantly in new equipment and training programs. But the results validated every aspect of Dad's vision for Morrison Construction's future. Most importantly, the success was based on exactly the expertise that Marcus had dismissed as impractical idealism. Environmental consulting knowledge that had once been seen as irrelevant to real construction work was now the foundation of Morrison Construction's competitive advantage and financial success. Standing on the Cascade Commons construction site one afternoon, watching our crews install solar panels with the same precision they'd once reserved for traditional roofing work, I realized that Dad's inheritance had been even more valuable than I'd initially understood. He hadn't just given me a construction company, he'd given me the opportunity to prove that being different from my family hadn't made me less capable of honoring our shared values of quality, integrity, and service to the community. The real test of that inheritance was just beginning, but Morrison Construction was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. 2 years after taking control of Morrison Construction, I stood on the completed Cascade Commons rooftop terrace, watching the sunset illuminate the solar array that had become the signature feature of our most successful project. The building had achieved LEED Platinum certification, exceeded its energy efficiency targets by 30%, and generated enough positive industry attention to establish Morrison Construction as the premier sustainable building firm in the Pacific Northwest. The celebration reception was winding down, but I lingered on the terrace, reflecting on the journey that had brought me from family disappointment to industry recognition. The success of Cascade Commons had exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own. What had started as a $12 million proof of concept had evolved into a template for sustainable development that was being studied and replicated throughout the construction industry. Pemberton Development Group had contracted Morrison Construction for 4 additional projects based on the Cascade Commons results, and we'd received inquiry calls from developers as far away as California and British Columbia. The financial transformation of Morrison Construction was equally dramatic. Our annual revenue had increased by 300% since Dad's death, while our profit margins had improved to levels that traditional construction companies couldn't match. The integrated environmental services that Marcus had once dismissed as government regulation nonsense were now generating 60% of our total income and allowing us to charge premium rates that reflected the specialized expertise we provided. More importantly, the company's reputation for innovation and environmental leadership had attracted the kind of talented employees who were excited about pushing the boundaries of sustainable construction. Our workforce had grown from 200 employees to nearly 400, including environmental engineers, renewable energy specialists, and construction technicians who brought cutting-edge expertise to every project. The industry recognition had been gratifying but not entirely surprising. Cascade Commons had won the Sustainable Building Award from the Pacific Northwest Construction Association, and Morrison Construction had been featured in construction trade magazines as a case study of successful business transformation. The attention validated Dad's vision while establishing credibility that opened doors to even more ambitious projects. Janet Kumar joined me on the terrace as the last guests were leaving the reception, carrying 2 glasses of champagne and wearing the satisfied expression of a consultant whose recommendations had exceeded all projections. I have to admit, Sarah, when your father first contacted me about helping Morrison Construction transition to sustainable building, I thought the timeline was overly ambitious, she said, handing me a glass and settling into one of the rooftop chairs. Traditional construction companies usually take 5 to 7 years to develop the capabilities you've achieved in 2. The accelerated timeline had been possible only because Dad's research and planning had been so thorough, and because my environmental consulting background had provided expertise that most construction companies had to develop from scratch. Instead of learning sustainable building practices as a new specialty, I'd been able to integrate existing knowledge with Morrison Construction's operational capabilities. The real key was having a team that was ready for change, I replied, thinking about Tom Rodriguez's enthusiasm for learning new construction techniques and Linda Chen's innovative financial management. Dad chose his advisory board well, and they made the transformation possible. Janet nodded, looking out over the city lights that were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Your father's letter was remarkably prescient about market trends. Demand for sustainable construction has grown even faster than his projections suggested, and Morrison Construction's early entry into the market has created competitive advantages that will be difficult for other firms to match. The competitive landscape had indeed shifted dramatically over the past 2 years. Several traditional construction companies had attempted to add environmental services to their offerings, but most had struggled to integrate sustainability features effectively with their existing operations. The piecemeal approach of hiring environmental consultants for specific projects couldn't match the seamless integration that Morrison Construction provided when environmental expertise was built into every aspect of project management. Our success had also attracted attention from potential competitors, including 2 large construction firms that had made acquisition offers for Morrison Construction over the past year. The financial terms had been tempting, but selling the company would have meant abandoning the vision that Dad had entrusted to me and eliminating the jobs he'd spent 50 years creating. Marcus had been instrumental in helping me resist the acquisition pressure, providing insights about the construction industry that proved his value despite his past mistakes. His rehabilitation over the past 2 years had been one of the most personally satisfying aspects of Morrison Construction's transformation, demonstrating that Dad's belief in the possibility of character growth had been justified. My brother's current role as facilities and equipment manager suited his operational strengths while keeping him away from financial authority and client relationships. He'd embraced the position with genuine enthusiasm, developing innovative maintenance procedures that extended equipment life and implementing safety protocols that had reduced workplace accidents to near zero. The change in Marcus's attitude had been gradual but unmistakable. The arrogance and dismissiveness that had characterized his previous behavior had been replaced by humility and genuine respect for expertise, regardless of its source. He'd even completed certification courses in sustainable construction practices, motivated not by career advancement but by genuine interest in understanding the technical aspects of our work. I owe you an apology that's about 2 years overdue, Marcus had told me during a quiet moment at the Cascade Commons groundbreaking ceremony. I was so focused on proving that I belonged in the family business that I couldn't see how much the business needed to change. Dad was right to choose you, and I'm proud of what you've accomplished. The reconciliation hadn't erased the years of conflict and contempt, but it had allowed us to work together professionally while slowly rebuilding personal trust. Marcus's operational knowledge remained valuable, and his support for the company's new direction had helped convince skeptical employees that the transformation was permanent rather than temporary. Grace had struggled more with the family's changed circumstances, particularly the financial adjustments required by Marcus's reduced income and the loss of their expected inheritance. Their marriage had survived the stress, but it had required significant lifestyle changes and honest conversations about priorities and values that had been difficult for both of them. The extended family had also needed time to adjust to Morrison Construction's transformation and my unexpected success as company owner. Relatives who had once treated my environmental consulting career as a phase to be outgrown now sought my advice about their own business challenges and career decisions. The shift in family dynamics had been satisfying but also bittersweet, highlighting how much energy I'd wasted over the years seeking approval that I'd never actually needed. Tom Rodriguez had proven to be an exceptional partner in leading Morrison Construction's growth, combining his decades of construction experience with genuine enthusiasm for learning sustainable building practices. His credibility with construction crews and subcontractors had been essential for implementing changes smoothly, while his willingness to embrace innovation had kept the company at the forefront of industry developments. The young workers especially have responded well to the changes, Tom had observed during one of our monthly management meetings. They see sustainable construction as the future of the industry and want to develop expertise that will advance their careers. The older workers have come around too, once they realize that environmental features don't make construction more complicated, just different. Chen had restructured Morrison Construction's financial systems to optimize the profitability of integrated environmental services while maintaining the cash flow stability that large construction projects required. Her analysis of project profitability had revealed that sustainable building features often reduce total construction costs while increasing client satisfaction and company profit margins. The key insight was recognizing that environmental features are investments rather than expenses, Linda explained to the business students who regularly toured Morrison Construction as part of their coursework on sustainable business practices. Solar panels reduce long-term energy costs, efficient insulation systems lower heating and cooling expenses, and water management features decrease utility bills. Clients are willing to pay higher construction costs because they save money over the building's lifetime. This financial analysis had allowed Morrison Construction to develop pricing strategies that reflected the true value of sustainable construction while remaining competitive with traditional building approaches. The approach had been so successful that several other construction companies had hired Linda as a consultant to help them understand the economics of environmental building services. The professional recognition I'd received had been personally meaningful but also strategically valuable for Morrison Construction's continued growth. Being invited to speak at construction industry conferences and serve on environmental building standards committees had established credibility that translated into client confidence and business opportunities. The speaking engagements had also allowed me to advocate for sustainable construction practices throughout the industry, sharing technical knowledge and business insights that helped other companies improve their environmental capabilities. The collaborative approach reflected Dad's belief that success was most meaningful when it contributed to broader positive change rather than just personal advancement. One of the most satisfying aspects of Morrison Construction's transformation had been the positive impact on employee satisfaction and career development. Workers who had once viewed their jobs as routine manual labor now saw themselves as skilled professionals contributing to innovative projects that made a meaningful difference in their communities. The company's commitment to ongoing training and professional development had created career advancement opportunities that attracted talented people from throughout the construction industry. Morrison Construction had become known as a place where ambitious workers could develop cutting-edge expertise while working on projects that pushed the boundaries of what sustainable construction could achieve. The environmental impact of our work had been equally gratifying. The buildings Morrison Construction had completed over the past 2 years had reduced energy consumption by an estimated 40% compared to traditional construction, while incorporating renewable energy systems that contributed clean power back to the electrical grid. The cumulative environmental benefit represented exactly the kind of positive change that had motivated my original interest in environmental consulting. The community response to Morrison Construction's transformation had been overwhelmingly positive, with local government officials regularly citing our projects as examples of how business innovation could address environmental challenges while creating economic opportunities. The company had become a source of civic pride in Willow Creek, demonstrating that small communities could incubate industry-leading businesses. The media attention had extended beyond construction trade publications to include features in business magazines and environmental journals that highlighted Morrison Construction as a successful model of corporate transformation. The coverage had attracted new clients while establishing my personal reputation as a business leader who had successfully combined environmental expertise with operational excellence. Standing on the Cascade Commons terrace as the celebration wound down, I pulled out my phone to reread the text message that had arrived earlier that afternoon. The message was from Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the environmental consultant who had served on the Pemberton Development Panel, informing me that Morrison Construction had been selected to lead the environmental construction component of a $50 million sustainable community development project in Vancouver, British Columbia. The Vancouver project represented everything Dad had envisioned for Morrison Construction's future: a leadership role in cutting-edge sustainable development, international recognition for environmental expertise, and the opportunity to create a model that would influence construction practices throughout North America. The contract would require expanding our workforce by another 100 employees and developing new capabilities in large-scale renewable energy integration, but the technical challenges were exactly the kind of problems I'd spent my career learning to solve. Janet Kumar had already begun developing a strategic plan for the Vancouver project, working with Tom Rodriguez and Linda Chen to ensure that Morrison Construction could scale its operations while maintaining the quality standards and innovative approach that had distinguished our previous work. The planning process was complex, but the team's confidence and expertise made the challenge feel manageable rather than overwhelming. The international expansion would also require sophisticated coordination with Canadian environmental regulations and construction standards, drawing on exactly the kind of cross-border expertise I'd developed during my environmental consulting career. The project represented a perfect integration of my professional background with Morrison Construction's operational capabilities. Marcus had volunteered to lead the equipment and logistics planning for the Vancouver project, proposing innovative approaches to managing construction resources across international borders while minimizing environmental impact. His enthusiasm for the technical challenges and his detailed knowledge of Morrison Construction's capabilities made him an ideal candidate for the assignment. "I've been researching Canadian equipment standards and import procedures," he told me during our planning meeting earlier that week. "There are some opportunities to partner with Canadian suppliers that could reduce costs while supporting local businesses." It's exactly the kind of integrated thinking Dad always encouraged. The reference to Dad's philosophy was typical of how Marcus had changed over the past 2 years. Instead of dismissing collaborative approaches as impractical complications, he now actively sought opportunities to create win-win solutions that benefited multiple stakeholders while advancing Morrison Construction's business interests. The success of our transformation had also attracted interest from business schools and management consulting firms that wanted to study Morrison Construction as an example of successful corporate change. The academic attention was flattering, but more importantly, it provided opportunities to influence how other companies approach similar transformations. Dr. Amanda Foster from the University of Oregon's Business School had spent 6 months documenting Morrison Construction's transformation for a case study that would be used in MBA programs throughout the country. Her research had revealed insights about change management and strategic planning that were valuable for companies in many different industries. What made Morrison Construction's transformation successful was the combination of clear vision, thorough preparation, and willingness to embrace fundamental change rather than incremental adjustment. Dr. Foster had concluded in her preliminary report. Sarah's environmental expertise provided technical credibility, but the real key was her ability to integrate that expertise with existing operational strengths rather than replacing them. The academic analysis validated the approach Dad had envisioned while providing frameworks that other companies could use to pursue similar transformations. The knowledge sharing reflected Morrison Construction's commitment to advancing sustainable construction practices throughout the industry rather than hoarding competitive advantages. As the evening grew cooler and the last guests departed from the Cascade Commons celebration, I walked through the building one final time, appreciating the integration of environmental features with elegant design and functional efficiency. The structure represented everything I'd hoped sustainable construction could achieve: beautiful, practical, profitable, and environmentally responsible. The lobby featured a living wall system that purified indoor air while creating a dramatic visual focal point. The offices incorporated natural lighting and passive climate control that reduced energy consumption while providing comfortable working environments. The rooftop terrace where we'd held the celebration included rainwater collection systems disguised as decorative fountains and garden features. Every aspect of Cascade Commons demonstrated that sustainable construction didn't require compromising aesthetics or functionality. The building was simultaneously high-performing and beautiful, efficient and comfortable, innovative and practical. It was exactly the kind of structure that could convince skeptics that environmental responsibility enhanced rather than limited architectural possibilities. The building's performance data had exceeded all projections, with energy consumption running 35% below the original targets and tenant satisfaction scores in the 95th percentile. The financial returns had been equally impressive, with Cascade Commons achieving full occupancy 6 months ahead of schedule and commanding rental rates that reflected the premium value of sustainable building features. Driving home to Willow Creek that evening, I stopped at Riverside Memorial Chapel where Dad was buried, wanting to share the success of the day with the person who had made it all possible. The cemetery was quiet and peaceful, with moonlight filtering through the oak trees that Dad had helped plant as part of a community beautification project 30 years earlier. Standing beside his grave, I thought about the journey from that devastating funeral day when Marcus had dismissed me as a failure to this evening's celebration of Morrison Construction's transformation into an industry leader. The change had been dramatic, but it had also felt inevitable, once I understood Dad's vision and committed to making it reality. "We did it, Dad," I said quietly, placing fresh flowers on his headstone. "Morrison Construction is exactly what you envisioned, and Marcus has become the kind of leader you always hoped he could be. The company is helping other businesses embrace sustainable practices, creating good jobs for hundreds of people, and proving that environmental responsibility and business success aren't just compatible, they're mutually reinforcing." The success had been deeply personal as well as professional. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely confident in my abilities and secure in my place within the family and the community. The years of feeling like an outsider, of having my expertise dismissed as impractical idealism, had been replaced by recognition and respect that felt genuine and well-earned. The transformation hadn't been easy, requiring long hours, difficult decisions, and constant learning about aspects of business management that hadn't been covered in my environmental engineering education. But the challenges had been stimulating rather than overwhelming, drawing on problem-solving skills and technical knowledge that I'd been developing throughout my career. Most importantly, the success had been meaningful rather than just profitable. Morrison Construction was contributing to positive environmental change while preserving the values of quality and integrity that Dad had built into the company's culture. The work was making a real difference in people's lives and communities, while generating the financial returns necessary for long-term sustainability. As I drove through downtown Willow Creek, past the buildings that Morrison Construction had helped create over 5 decades, I realized that Dad's inheritance had been even more valuable than I'd initially understood. He hadn't just given me a business opportunity, he'd given me the chance to prove that being different from my family didn't mean being disconnected from our shared values and legacy. The future looked brighter than I'd ever dared to imagine. Morrison Construction had established itself as a leader in sustainable building practices with a project pipeline that extended 3 years into the future. The Vancouver project would establish our international reputation, while the continued success of projects like Cascade Commons would reinforce our position as the premier sustainable construction firm in the Pacific Northwest. The personal relationships that had been damaged by years of family conflict were healing gradually but steadily. Marcus and I had developed a professional partnership based on mutual respect and complementary expertise, while our extended family had learned to appreciate the success we'd achieved together, rather than focusing on past disappointments and misunderstandings. The industry recognition and business success had been gratifying, but the most meaningful achievement was the knowledge that Morrison Construction was making a positive contribution to addressing environmental challenges while honoring the legacy of craftsmanship and community service that Dad had established. The company was simultaneously preserving tradition and embracing innovation, proving that sustainable progress was possible when expertise and vision were combined with determination and integrity. Standing in my office late that night, reviewing the project plans for Vancouver and 3 other major developments that would shape Morrison Construction's future, I understood finally that Dad's greatest gift hadn't been the inheritance of a business, but the opportunity to discover my own potential for leadership and positive impact. The missing chair at his funeral had led to the most fulfilling and meaningful work of my life, transforming both Morrison Construction and my understanding of what it meant to honor family legacy while forging an independent path. The journey from family disappointment to industry leader had been unexpected and challenging, but it had also been exactly the adventure that Dad had hoped I'd embrace when he made his final transformative decision about Morrison Construction's future. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.